Hello, everyone. Welcome to all, and thank you for participating in this G78 webinar on Pathways to Peace in the Middle East and Canada's potential role. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78, which is based in Ottawa, Canada. In holding this event, we pay respect to the Algonquin people who have been the traditional guardians of this land. We honor their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all First Nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We also pay respect to the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I hardly need to say that the topic for today's webinar is contentious. The devastating war between Israel and Gaza since the attacks of Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, has resulted in the deaths of over 1,700 Israelis and over 44,000 Palestinians, nearly 70% of the latter being women and children. But according to the UK medical journal The Lancet in July 2024, it is not implausible to estimate that some 186,000 or more direct and indirect Palestinian deaths could be attributable to the current conflict in Gaza. Much of the housing stock and infrastructure in Gaza is rubble, and many of the Palestinian dead are buried under the rubble. Yet the war continues to rage on, with a glimmer of light coming from the ceasefire in Lebanon. To help us understand why it has been so difficult to agree on a durable ceasefire to the conflict, let alone a resolution of longer-term measures to resolve deeper issues generating the conflict, we are privileged in hosting two knowledgeable speakers who are passionate about the urgent need to achieve a durable and just peace between Israel and Palestine. We have asked both to discuss whether and how such a peace is possible, and if so, how Canada can play a role in peace building. However, I'd like to make it clear that neither of our speakers today are representing the position of the Group of 78, its board, its members, or its supporters. I shall introduce speakers very briefly. You can read more in the promotional flyers for this event. In setting up this webinar, we asked the speakers that their discussion be conversational rather than a debate, a conversation in which both seek common ground and areas of agreement on which a durable and just peace might be built. To get the discussion going, I shall ask our speakers three questions, beginning with their reflections on their involvement with the issues of war and peace between Israel and Palestine, going back at least 7 decades. So our first speaker is Peter Larson, who is the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. For 20 years, Peter has been visiting Israel, Iran, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. He has led many trips to the region for Canadians interested in gaining a deeper understanding of the issues involved. He's a frequent lecturer for church groups, retiree associations, service clubs, and universities. He was the founding chair of the Middle East Study Group of the Canadian International Council. In 2012, he was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal by the Governor-General of Canada in recognition of his educational work on Canada-Arab relations. Reuven Schultz began his association with Canadian Friends of Peace Now around the time of the 1982 Lebanon invasion, and is currently chair of the Montreal chapter. CFPN promotes understanding of Israeli-Palestine peace issues among Canadians, including Canada's Jewish communities. It focuses on the importance of achieving a negotiated two-state solution for the sake of both peoples. His hope that diplomacy would lead to the recognition of Palestinian statehood, coexistence, and confederation remains unrealized. Reuven is particularly interested in what Canada can contribute to peace building, and he'll be making some remarks on that score. Okay, so the first question or request is please introduce yourself and share with us your involvement with the issues of war and peace that have afflicted the Middle East, particularly relations between Israel and Palestine for over 7 decades. Peter, may I invite you to go first?
Thanks, Roy. And thank you to the Group of 78 for taking up this touchy issue. I know the Group of 78 deals with a wide range of human rights justice issues, and I'm glad that this one is one of the ones that's on your plate. I also want to thank Reuven for taking up the challenge of trying to undertake a free and frank discussion on this delicate issue. His organization, CFPN, has been a very courageous in some of his criticisms of Israel, and I admire and recognize him and them for that. My own involvement with the Israel-Palestine issue began more than 60 years ago when I was in high school in Toronto. A lot of my classmates in that school were Jewish, and I learned about anti-Semitism from them. I was 15 years old when the blockbuster movie Exodus came out, and I went to see it with a number of my Jewish friends. And I was captivated by the story of Jews standing up and fighting for their rights, plucky David fighting the Arab Goliath. I became 100% Zionist. I didn't know the word Zionism at the time, of course, but I completely agreed that Jews were safer and the world was a better place by the creation of Israel. When the Six-Day War broke out, I was completely on Israel's side. But as time went on and Israel refused to give up the occupied territories, my position started to waver a bit. Images of young Palestinian boys throwing rocks at Israeli tanks challenged my sense of who was David and who was Goliath after all. I still supported the idea of a Jewish state, but thought Israel should give back the West Bank and Gaza and allow the Palestinians to have their own state on the remaining 22% of historic Palestine. I had evolved then from my Israel no matter what earlier Zionism to what today might be called liberal Zionism. Sometime around 2005, I took another step in my evolution. I went to hear Gideon Levy speak at Carleton University. Many of you might know who Gideon Levy is, a well-known journalist for Haaretz newspaper, the Israeli Daily. And Levy was very critical of Israel, not only of the occupation, but of how Israel treats its own Palestinian citizens. And that led me to want to go a little bit deeper. I started reading books by non-Zionist Jews, people like Ilan Pappé or Avi Shlaim or Norman Finkelstein. And in 2009, I decided to go see for myself. So I signed up for a tour group organized by left-wing Israeli Jews. And what I saw in the West Bank was shocking, frankly. The wall, the checkpoints, the demolished houses. It's hard to really assimilate that from Canada if you don't go there. And for the first time, I met Palestinians. I stayed with a few Palestinian families. And the stories they told me were shocking about seeing their olive trees cut down or their sheep poisoned by settlers or being imprisoned or tortured by Israeli soldiers when they tried to resist. Now, I returned to the region many times, and each time I sought to explore another aspect of the Israel-Palestine issue. In addition to traveling around the West Bank, I went to Gaza several times. I visited Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan and in Lebanon. I also talked to many Palestinians living inside Israel as citizens, and they told me that while Israel may be a democracy for Jews, for the 20% of non-Jews, the reality in Israel is quite different. There are many restrictions on where they can live or work, for example. I came to feel and recognize that Israel's problems were a lot deeper. They didn't begin in 1967, but much earlier, in 1948. I came to believe that the very creation of a Jewish state required the ethnic cleansing of most of the Palestinians and the growth of an apartheid system to make sure that Jews remained in the majority. That set in motion an inevitable and unending cycle of repression and resistance, a cycle that is today spiraling out of control. I now believe that the genocide unfolding in Gaza today is the inevitable and direct consequence of the 1948 UN decision to carve out a Jewish state for European Jews in Mandate Palestine over the objection of the locals. Given their history, I understand and I believe that Jews need and deserve protection. But I don't think that carving a Jewish state out of Palestine and expelling the people who live there was a good way to do it. And I don't think it can work. That's my.
Thank you, Peter. Reuven, would you like
Thank
to?
you, Peter, and thank you, Roy, for the introduction. I don't have an extensive biography to provide. I became involved in Zionism. I think by having a trip to Israel, I went to kibbutz and I learned Hebrew, and I benefited from that. And I came with a friend who benefited very much. He was sick when he came, and he was not sick when we left. But I became interested in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. On our kibbutz, people were very much concerned about justice in the Middle East and were against the occupation, and looked forward to when Israel would leave the territories. In 1990, in the early 1990s, I was moved by the election in the Labour Party by Yitzhak Rabin. And with Yitzhak Rabin's election was a new way of thinking about the Middle East among Jews. It meant that we can recognize Palestinians, we could talk about them. The Labour Party at that time had a convention before Rabin's election. And for the first time, they recognized the right of Palestinians to self-determination. I don't think that, the Oslo Accords were an effort to create a two-state solution, but at first it wasn't seen as a two-state solution, but as a way of recognizing the rights of Palestinians to their own lives and for autonomy at least. The language at the time of the Oslo Accords started to change. Before the Oslo Accords, among Zionists, it was impossible to say Palestinian. It was impossible to recognize the PLO, and it became normal to recognize the PLO and the rights of Palestinians to their lives. It became better for the Israelis because the sense of peace, the sense of coexistence became palpable. There were more and more dialogue groups set up between Jews and Palestinians. There were more and more efforts for understanding. We were learning each other's history. It seemed to be like a renaissance that was taking place. And that occurred until, the major break was the assassination of the prime minister in 1995. And after that, things started to go south. 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected as president of Israel, and he was very much opposed to a peace process, and he tried to whittle it down and to undermine it as much as possible. Then the prime minister was Ehud Barak, and Ehud Barak, elected with the promise of peacemaking, went to Camp David, and in my opinion, he didn't negotiate very well or very honestly. And when the negotiations failed, he blamed it on Yasser Arafat, and he said that now we have no more partner for peace. In Peace Now, as an organization in Montreal, we lost a lot of membership because as soon as people believed we had no partner, what was the point of being involved in Peace Now? And the atmosphere changed dramatically. That was in the year 2000. And then in a very short time, the Likud was elected. And the program of the Likud is to promote settlements, which is against the program at that time at the Labour Party and of Peace Now. And since then, settlements have been growing. Nationalism has been growing. And I think that the unbridled nationalism that has been set loose in the last few years is a fault of, it has many reasons, but has been the result of the growth of a national religious party that does not see two-state solution as a viable answer to the situation of the Jews in Israel. So right now I'm beside myself. I don't know what to say. I see many reasons for the present disastrous situation. I think that the attack on October 7th by Hamas on Israel was the most insane, self-destructive act that could have been imagined. Even though it was brilliant, it was brilliantly stupid. And it has resulted in massive hatred, which I've never seen before, and a massive desire for the Israeli population not to live with Palestinians anymore at all. And I don't know where this will take us, but right now the situation isn't good. But on the other hand, I think that during every war propaganda is such that people hate each other. And then when the war passes, like a virus, like a pandemic, things settle down and maybe people can start to think differently.
Thank you, Reuven. Peter, did you have any comments or reflections on what Reuven has just said?
What? Not right now. I mean, I agree with a lot of what he said. I'd rather wait till we have a general discussion, if that's okay, Roy.
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah.
Reuven, did you have anything else to say by way of reflection on Peter's initial remarks?
I could see where he's coming from, and I think it's legitimate. I don't agree, but I think it's legitimate.
Okay, let's move on then. The latest episode of war in the Middle East has lasted over 15 months. In addition to the conflict between Israel and Gaza, war has now encompassed the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, although we've seemed to have arrived at a ceasefire in Lebanon. There's also the possibility of war with Iran. So here's the really difficult question I'm throwing out to both of you. Are there openings for de-escalation, ceasefire, and long-term peace? Is a two-state solution even achievable at this point? Who'd like to pick up on that first?
Peter, go ahead.
Sure, okay. There were two parts of the question that you originally posed, Roy. One was ceasefire and the other is long-term peace. And I'd like to deal with each of them separately because I think the answers are different. In terms of a ceasefire, I think a ceasefire will come when America says it's time. The fiction that despite its trillion-dollar military budget and its enormous economic and diplomatic clout, the USA was unable to stop the Israeli attack on Gaza is ludicrous. As long as Israel had the green light and the active support of the Biden administration, Israel had no need for a ceasefire and could continue its program of annihilating the Palestinians in Gaza. Remember that Hamas signaled last July that it accepted the ceasefire proposal put forward by Biden, the one that went to the Security Council. But Israel showed no interest in it in negotiations. Israel actually assassinated the top Hamas negotiator and then assassinated his replacement. We all know, and Rueven has, I think, alluded to this already, Bibi is quite unpopular in Israel, but polls show now that the Israelis support his genocidal attack on Gaza. Something like 70% of Israelis say that Israel is either doing the right thing or not enough in Gaza. So a ceasefire can only come about when America says enough, and it actually seems that maybe this week that's going to be, according to the current news items. I think it cannot be coincidental that we're talking about a ceasefire just as Biden's term comes to an end. But what about a long-term peace? I think that's a different calculus. A long-term peace requires looking more deeply at the issues. I think it's a law of human nature that oppression breeds resistance, and the intensity of that resistance will be shaped by the intensity of the oppression. Palestinians have been resisting the colonization of their land since the British took it over in 1921. That resistance is not an anomaly. Black and brown people have joined movements to resist settler colonialism around the world, including here in Canada, as alluded to by Roy's comments on recognition of land. Hamas is not the first Palestinian resistance movement. In fact, the first one was the Palestinian National Congress in 1921. It sent a delegation to the Paris peace talks to oppose the British mandate and to call for democracy and Palestinian independence. Remember, at the time, in 1921, Jews were 6% of the Palestinian population. When those delegates returned to Palestine, the British Mandate authorities threw them all in jail. Later on, there was a secular resistance movement called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat. He was eventually imprisoned or captured and put under control by Israel and eventually assassinated. So today we have the Islamic resistance movement. What will the next resistance movement be? I don't know. But I'm certain there will be a new one unless and until there is a new arrangement made or the Palestinians are completely exterminated. I invite you to do a counterfactual thought experiment. When Britain was contemplating the idea of creating a Jewish state, one of the ideas that was mooted was to put it in East Africa, then under British imperial control. So what would have been the reaction of Bantu tribesmen if Britain had decided to give all or part of Uganda or Kenya to European Jewish immigrants in order to create a Jewish state? Of course, they would have had to expel thousands of black tribesmen. How would they have reacted? Actually, we don't even need to imagine what would have happened. The Mau Mau movement was exactly that kind of resistance movement to resist white colonization. It was accused of terrorism. And if a Jewish state had been founded there, no doubt the Mau Mau would have been accused of anti-Semitism today. In my view, a long-term peace in Israel-Palestine can only come about through a deep process of truth and reconciliation, a recognition that the expulsion of the Palestinians to create a state for European Jews was unfair, and a decision to make amends, recognizing that Jewish lives and Palestinian lives are of equal importance. Where there is equality, hostility and anger diminishes. The Zionist idea, which some Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem have called Jewish supremacy, must be wrestled to the ground. But going forward, could this ever happen? It won't be easy. Israel's actions over the last 76 years have generated a lot of animosity amongst Palestinians. Who can blame them? But history shows that with time, the deepest animosity can be overcome. Germany has apologized over and over again for the horrific things it did to Jews in the Second World War. Today, Jews are protected in Germany, not only by law, but by common acceptance. And only 2 generations after the Holocaust, young Israeli Jews flocked to Berlin for work and recreation. So that kind of reconciliation will be possible on the basis of equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Reuven?
I understand that there's going to be a solution. The hostages might be released. I read an article by Gershon Baskin the other day where he said that it could happen, but he advised that Hamas make it known what the terms are so that they can get acceptance in Israel and by the wider world, because a lot of people are sick of the war. So I don't know if a hostage agreement will come about. We heard before the convention of the Democratic Party that there's going to be an imminent agreement, that Netanyahu has agreed to an agreement, but it's contrary to Benjamin Netanyahu's interest to have an agreement, because if he has an agreement, he has to have an election, and he doesn't want to have an election, because if he has an election, he is likely to be defeated, even though since the last couple months and his victory against Hezbollah and his entry into Syria, his popularity has gone up, but his coalition partners, their popularity have gone down. Many people do not share their extremist views and would not vote for them. But so I think there's a chance for an agreement, but I think that's, until it happens, it's all speculation. As far as what's going on elsewhere in the Middle East, Syria is a hopeful sign. It's actually a sign that things could improve, because all of a sudden there's been a revolution or an overthrow of a dictator who was very horrible. And if the Western countries like the United States and Europe remove sanctions against Syria, it's very likely to be able to flourish, or the possibilities of flourishing are much greater than if the sanctions remain. So as far as Israel and the rest and its ability to make peace, that will depend on on too many unknown factors. We don't know what kind of outcome will be of this war. There's been so much damage, so much destruction. It's been going on for so long, and there is no end game by the present political leaders. At the beginning, after the events of October 7th, when President Biden came to Israel and he said that we will help you, the United States will help you, and we want, though, a two-state solution coming out of this. We want the end of the occupation. We want to see some type of peace agreement. He did nothing at all to further it, and I think he discredited a lot of the possibility, the imagination that and the hope for such an agreement to ever come about. So we're in a very difficult situation as far as that goes. And now that the International Criminal Court has sent warrants out to the Israeli leaders, as well as the Hamas leaders who are now dead, there is resistance in Israel to the idea of an international court, an international law. UNRWA has been defamed, and much of the UN has been subjected to all kind of attacks, and so our international system as a whole is in trouble, and I don't think that's going to be good for anybody. So that's what. So our long-term prospects for peace are not good. They're very dark.
Can I ask the both of you, is it time to say goodbye to a two-state solution and think in terms of a one-state solution that's free and democratic, in which Palestinians and Jews are co-equals? Is that even conceivable as the alternative for a long
You want to speak first? I could speak to this right away.
Okay.
I think that a two-state solution is the only possible solution. The people hate each other. Can you imagine a state where people have to make decisions, important political decisions, when they despise each other and do not trust each other? I think a commonwealth might help. You know, many years ago, Shimon Peres wrote a book called The New Middle East. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he gave the example of Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet was one of the fathers of the European Union. And after the Second World War, he said, you know, it's going to be impossible. He didn't say, many people said, it will be impossible for the French and the Germans ever to get along. Everything is ruined now because of the war. They made slaves out of us. They killed so many people. They're monsters. We cannot live with them. And Jean Monnet said, we do not want to repeat the sins of the past. We made mistakes. We do not want to repeat them. And the way we can avoid that is by having economic cooperation. So he set up instruments for economic cooperation between Germany and France. And soon they were working together on joint projects. They weren't living together, but they were working together. And soon they start to trust each other. And soon came about the European Economic Union. And then we have a European Union because people learned to work together. If we do not do things that bring us together, we will never live together. But to live together for Jews and Palestinians in one state, because of their enmity, because too many people among us harbor enmities that are incurable, I don't think this is possible. So I think a two-state solution is the only workable outcome.
Peter, comments on this question?
As a Canadian, I don't really have an a priori preference for one state or two states or three states. I'm not going to live there. I think it's got to be up to Palestinians and Israelis to figure out what kind of configuration they want. But as an observer, I think there could be a two-state deal, but I don't think it can possibly work. It won't last very long. If the Palestinians decide that it's, in the end, given their weak position and so on, they're better to say, okay, we will concede that Israelis, mostly Jewish immigrants get to keep 78% of original Palestine, that we're prepared to live on only 28%, 22% of it, most of it being desert, by the way. We're prepared to give up the right of the refugees to return, that they can live somewhere else, but they don't get. We're prepared to concede the fact that the Palestinians living inside Israel in a Jewish state will live as second-class citizens forever. If they decide that, that's their call. But frankly, I think any Palestinian leader who signed that would very soon find there'd be a lot of unhappiness and revolt, and that such a deal could not hold because it doesn't deal with the question of equality and respect. And so I think if you look at the long term, 2 generations, 3 generations, the only way you can ever get peace and equality, peace in the region, is when there's equality. And then the number of states isn't so important as the respect between the two peoples.
Okay, moving on to the third question I had posed. The inauguration of Donald Trump as president for a second term adds another huge challenge to the prospects of peace, if there are any left at all, either in the short term or in the long term. So what roles can third parties, including the USA under Trump, other countries in the Middle East, and Canada in particular, play in bringing about peace and stability? Reuven, can I ask you to start on this one?
Sure. I'll tell you. Today there was an article about the Saudis. The Saudis still believe a deal is possible, so the rumor goes. And for a deal to be possible, they would have to have Israel accept the idea of a Palestinian state. Now, there's a lot of reasons why Israel wouldn't want to accept the Palestinian state, except that the idea of normalization is very attractive to many people. It would be attractive to Trump, who has a lot of ideas of business interests in Saudi Arabia and to make business with Saudis. And they might be a force in creating a solution in the near future. The MBS in this article said that his country in Saudi Arabia, 70% of the population is younger than he is, and he's a relatively young man. And in the last year and a half, people are fixed on the Palestinian issue, and they are very concerned about its outcome. And it's true in the rest of the Arab world. If there is no outcome, things are going to be very, very unstable. And he believes an outcome is absolutely necessary, and he has Trump's ear. I don't trust Trump for anything, but if Trump sees a self-interest in a deal, then it's possible. So I think that's the role of a third party. As far as Canada goes, I'd like to talk about that after Peter makes a comment, and then if I may.
Okay, Peter?
Sure. Okay. Thanks. I've already said what I think the U.S. role can be in the ceasefire. Basically, they can pull the plug and stop at any time. And the role of the neighboring Arab states is very complicated, and that's an issue we could get into. I agree with what Reuven said, that the neighboring states, at least their peoples, are very unhappy. Their rulers seem to be more willing to make compromises, but that's a different issue. I'd like to just focus on what Canada could or should do. As we all know, people in the group of 78 know, that Canada actually has fairly limited leverage in this issue. But it is a middle power, and we can show leadership and exercise moral suasion, as we did in the case, for example, of South Africa. I think there are 4 concrete things that Canada could do. First of all, Canada has the ability to bring limited direct pressure on Israel. A recent letter from the moderator of the United Church of Canada to Prime Minister Trudeau urged that Canada take a more principled role, and a quote here from the moderator's letter. Quote, "We urge the government of Canada to suspend diplomatic relations with Israel with immediate effect and impose lawful, targeted economic and political sanctions against Israel as it did during South Africa." End quote. His letter included a series of practical steps which it urged on the Canadian government, including condemning the targeting of schools by the IDF and other violence against civilians, a call for an end to the blockade on Gaza, recalling Canada's ambassador to Israel, implementing a comprehensive two-way arms embargo. Canada still provides military equipment to Israel, and suspending the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. Those were the recommendations of the United Church. Second, I think, and I'll refer to Reuven here, I think we should endorse and support the CFPN campaign against settlement activities in the West Bank and against the racist extremist government of Netanyahu. Prime Minister Trudeau has already said he would respect the ICC ruling calling for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant. But as we know, he is under considerable pressure to walk that back, both from right-wing groups in Canada like CIJA and B'nai B'rith, but also from the USA. CFPN recently published a powerful appeal from John Allen, a former Canadian ambassador to Israel, explaining why Canada should stand up and defend the ICC decision. The third thing we can do is we can actively work with like-minded international partners to support the international rules-based order. Canada has already made some steps in this direction. These should be maintained or intensified. For example, at the UN, Canada has recently made a few faltering steps to detach itself from Israel and the USA. Last November, we voted with 159 countries to urge the UN to continue to support UNRWA. But then a few weeks later, we voted with Israel and the USA against a Norwegian motion to ask the International Court of Justice to render an opinion on Israel's policy of deliberate starvation in Gaza. So our record has been very spotty. I think that Canada should join the over 146 other countries in the world which recognize the state of Palestine. We can also provide much needed humanitarian assistance to Palestinians and working with UN refugee agencies. On the downside, Canada has not followed up on the call of the International Court of Justice to all members, including Canada, to enforce its ruling that all Israeli activities in the West Bank are illegal. And finally, I think we have to continue to work with the USA. The USA remains our largest trading partner. Mr. Trump is very unpredictable and volatile. We have to be careful of that. We cannot, doesn't mean we have to do everything the USA wants, but we do have to be careful. Canada can lean in the direction of justice without poking the world's only superpower in the eye. In conclusion, I think Canada should remain principled but modest and careful. It should cultivate relations with like-minded nations to advance joint positions and initiatives. And that's the best contribution we can make to lean in the direction of peace, justice, and stability in the Middle East.
Okay, before I turn it over to Reuven, I just want to say to our attendees, if you'd like to raise a question, please enter them in the Q&A rather than the chat. I've seen a couple of comments on the chat already. So Reuven, over to you. You had some thoughts on Canada's potential role.
My main thought is this. The Liberal Party has lost the confidence of the NDP. And the NDP will vote or some members of the NDP will vote will vote for dissolution of the government after there's a new leader and after the government is after the proroguing of Parliament when it returns to session. I think that would spell disaster. I think that at this time, we talk about the difficulty of Israeli-Palestinian peace, of compromise. It is extremely difficult. But I think at this time, the different parties, the NDP and the Liberals, have to compromise. Because if they do not join together for this election, it's going to be lost to conservatives who are against the International Criminal Court and against doing anything about global warming and against policies that will ensure Canada's future in a peaceful world. We must work together, otherwise we will fall. We don't have a choice in this matter. We have any type of prospect that you have that Canada take a position on Palestine or any other issue connected to peace. It's just going to be hopeless if the two parties are going to be against each other. Liberals think that the Trudeau has gone too far to the left. NDPers think that Jagmeet Singh is going too far to the right. It's a crazy situation. It's a situation that demands compromise. And if we don't have compromise and the two parties are going to be at each other's throat, they're opening the door to the conservatives who are way ahead in the polls. There has to be some type of conservative effort at this time if we do not want to lose 10 years or 5 years in the struggle against global warming and the struggle for peace to unite the two parties. It's a terrible situation, but the two parties cannot be at each other's throats. They have to be united. There cannot be a vote of non-confidence. They have to work together. It's not likely to happen, but if it doesn't happen, we're looking forward to a very bad time. That's what I want to say.
Okay, that goes a bit beyond the bounds of what we were discussing today, but they're interesting and
It's not for me. It's not beyond bounds because of the International Criminal Court that it's functioning, be supported by Canada is very important. And Poilievre has vowed to oppose it. He will join Trump in trying to undermine the UN and in trying to destroy UNRWA. That is so. I think that if you want that to be prevented, you have to prevent a Poilievre government.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Let's go to our audience now, and thank you for your patience. There are a couple of comments or questions in the queue. One by Claire Adamson, who writes, 50% division of land would allow the West Bank to join Gaza and be more fair. These two provinces would have a common union to govern disagreements. The provinces would have to diversify requirements to respect different cultures. Do either of you want to comment on this question?
I'll pass on that one.
I think that it's not about the division of land. That's not the best way to approach the issue. That even if in a situation where Israel is by far the more powerful partner, and where it is consumed with the ideology of Zionism that it has the right to the land, then drawing a line in the sand is not going to last very long. The Zionists who believe that God has given them that land won't be happy with the line. They'll be keeping chomping at the bit, and the Palestinians will feel that their land has been unfairly taken from them. So they're going to continue to be incidents, one side or the other, and in those incidents, Israel will be stronger. So I just don't think that that's going to solve it's not drawing the right line in the sand that will solve this issue.
Okay, Corinne writes, when I look at the record of the international world order, I see nothing to recommend it. I only see the rule of corporations and a lot of world crime. Please defend this record. So here's someone who has very little faith in what international law and multilateral cooperation might be able to achieve. Responses by either of you?
It's too big a request, but I think that we take for granted the type of cooperation we have had since World War II. The lessons were learned in World War II, and after World War II, as a result of those lessons, decolonization in the world took place. Cooperation between nations took place. It was even in the period of Cold War, we didn't have a hot war. I mean, a major hot war, a nuclear war. We had many wars. But the nature of cooperation was so great, despite corporations, despite malfactors in the world, that we shouldn't take those areas of cooperation for granted. A lot was achieved in terms of human rights. Before World War II, we never talked about human rights. Now we talk about human rights all the time. So I think that much has been achieved, and I think that it would be too much of an ask to answer such a question now. It's like explaining the Torah standing on one leg.
Peter?
I haven't had any experience trying to explain the Torah standing on one leg, but I'm sure it's a pretty difficult exercise. I think we have to think of international law as an expression both of values and of power relations at a given point in time. Right now, more and more we see that international law is being breached. Israel has been brought before the International Court of Justice, by the International Criminal Court, and yet the international institutions have been unable to implement the law. So that our whole system that we created starting in 1945, based on the notion of human rights, equality, Westphalia, and so on, is now actually being challenged. And in fact, I'm doing a webinar this Friday with David Kattenberg in the Netherlands on the concerns that people have in The Hague over what's happening to the international law. But international law is a statement of what we believe is right. Don't forget, Israel was created by UN resolution 181. And at that time, the majority of the world thought that it was a good idea. Now, I've told you, now I no longer think it was a good idea. I understood why it happened. But international laws come and go, and they depend on understand. Colonialism was something that was widely accepted. Now it's no longer accepted.
Okay, Irvin Waller writes, the NDP policy on Gaza and the Middle East seems to agree with both speakers. Could Liberals move to agree with the NDP on these issues? Reuven, why don't you have a go at that? Because
I'm not a Liberal Party member, but I could tell you that I was very heartened by the sanctioning of Amana. It's a settler organization that the Liberal government or the foreign ministry imposed, and they've been taking actions very gradually against the settlers, and they still support the two-state solution. So I think that however modest the advances have been, they're there, and despite a very vehement opposition.
Okay, here's a question that relates to one of the things that was said during the discussion. Why has Saudi allowed the genocide to happen? I guess you could ask more generally, why have Arab countries not weighed in as much as their populations have weighed in on this issue?
Do you want to answer, Peter?
Well, I give my thoughts on it. I certainly don't have the definitive answer, but I think it's very clear that whether it's Sisi in Egypt or the King of Jordan or MBS in Saudi, they very much depend on the U.S. for their continued existence. Sisi is a very good example. It was a coup when the Muslim Brotherhood took power in Egypt. So these folks, I'm sure, I read somewhere that during the day they make terrible speeches or brilliant speeches against Israel, but at night they hope that Israel defeats Hamas. Because if there is a popular uprising and Israel turns out not to be able to put it down, that puts their own situations in jeopardy. So these Arab dictators don't give a whit about human rights or equality or about the Palestinians, for that matter. They're worried about business. And so any idea that there should be Arab solidarity just on the basis of Arabism, I think is a fond wish, and I don't think it holds any reality. It is true in the Arab street, as Reuven pointed out, that there is widespread support, and that's not surprising. You know, during those, you remember some events in Amsterdam. Some Israeli soccer fans came to Amsterdam, and they were parading through the streets of Amsterdam, shouting "Death to Arabs." Well, death to Arabs is not a very good policy for Israel. 7 million Jews in a sea of 200 million Arabs. Death to Arabs is the chant that's chanted every year on Jerusalem Day as these right-wing Jewish bigots go through the old city. The anti-Arab racism is intense in Israel, and notwithstanding some people like Reuven and others who try to go against the current, I'm afraid the dominant current is very racist.
Okay, thank you to you both. Gabriella Gallagher asks Reuven to speak about why Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish homeland, one that respects the rights of minorities, of course. Reuven.
Gabriella, there is no question for me that Israel has a right to exist. It's the realization of a long dream, and it's been the product of many years of homelessness. The Jews have always believed that they have a right to their own political independence and their own homeland. so where their culture and language and destiny can thrive.
Peter, you wouldn't disagree with that, or would you?
Well, in a sense, of course, I agree with the desire to have a place where you can speak your own language, have your own culture, so on and so forth. But as a legal matter, states don't have a right to exist. Today, does Syria have a right to exist, or does Lebanon have a right to exist? Does Canada have a right to exist? I mean, states come and go. So Israel was created in 1948. Will it be it's still in existence in 2048? I don't know. Will Canada be existing in we look at Quebec independence, Donald Trump. Over the 21st century, many states came into being, like the Soviet Union came into being, and then it disappeared. So I don't think that Israel has an absolute right to exist in a legal sense, but I certainly understand the desire and the thirst for a place where you can live freely, you can live within your own cultural bounds, with your own language, your schooling, so on and so forth. That I have no problem with, and I endorse it.
Okay, I'm just going to skip over a couple of questions here. Eileen Alexiak asks, wouldn't a two-state solution mean that each party had a portion of land to govern and settle? The jigsaw puzzle of Israeli settlements prevents the establishment of contiguous Palestinian land. Geographically, what would a Palestinian state look like? Peter?
Well, I think that certainly the existence of the main purpose of the construction of the settlements was to create facts on the ground to prevent the creation of a two-state solution. I mean, that seems to be widely accepted. But I'm actually of the opinion, even if all the settlements were withdrawn, the two-state solution still wouldn't work. It is because, certainly if it's based on what is widely held to be the normal basis for a two-state solution, which we call the pre-67 borders, which gives Israel 78% of the landmass and it gives the Palestinians 22%. I think it would be basically so unfair that it couldn't hold. People would not be happy with it. The refugees wouldn't be happy with it. The people living in Israel wouldn't. The Palestinians living in Israel wouldn't be happy with it. The Palestinians living in the West and the Zionists wouldn't be happy with it. So it just won't work, in my view. It's not because I think one's the right answer or the wrong answer. I think it's an unworkable solution.
Reuven, would you agree with that? I mean, is there any...
No, I think that to withdraw from the West Bank would be a great solution. It would be something that right now we can't even conceive of. It would allow the Palestinians in the West Bank to have their own land again and not to be harassed by checkpoints and soldiers and be able to establish their own system of justice, of law and government. It would be a great gain, and it would be a great gain for the Jewish people too, because they would have there would be the possibility of living together with neighbors. It would be ending the occupation. I look at what happened when France left Algeria. Yeah, I mean, there was a terrible civil war. There were colonizers and they went a great distance to colonize, but the French were very deeply rooted in Algeria, but they left. And when they left Algeria, there was tremendous turmoil. It was a war that meant a lot of loss of lives in Algeria, and a lot of French soldiers were killed, not as many as those in Algeria. But the economy flourished in France. It went through a boom because they weren't expending money on a colony. And I think it would be a great advantage to end colonization for the Jewish people, to stop colonies in the West Bank. So I think it would be easier to settle, to live together if that wasn't in the way. And it would be impossible. It looks impossible right now. So it's nearly like a dream. But the fact is that things that look impossible one day become possible the next day. But the essential idea of a land of Israel is very deeply rooted in most Jewish people, and they would not give up on it. That is something that they wouldn't give up on. And if the possibility of living in peace was manifest.
So I think there's a slight disagreement between Reuven and Peter on this issue, but they both presented their case very adequately, I think.
I'll say something. I will try to summarize what I think is the fundamental difference. And I'm glad that Reuven's expressing his point of view clearly. I think that the cornerstone of Reuven's argument is that there should be a Jewish state for all kinds of historical reasons. He hasn't invoked any religious reasons, but for historical reasons, there needs to be a Jewish state. And he's willing to make considerable compromises to make that the least onerous possible on the Palestinians. That's kind of my summary of your position. You can correct me afterwards, Reuven, if that's unfair. But the cornerstone is that there should be a Jewish state, but we want it to harm the Palestinians as little as possible. And I come at it from I think that Palestinian human rights are just as important as Jewish rights. So I come from the point of view of saying, I think the Palestinians should have their state. And I think the compromise should be made to accommodate the Jews as best as possible. So it's a total 180-degree sort of difference, but based on the fact that we both think that I think we both agree that something kind of like we have in Canada, whatever, where rights, individual rights and religious rights and so on are respected, is a much better way of going than what we have underway now.
Well, Amos Oz had an analogy for the differences of opinion, and he says, in a Shakespearean play, everybody's right, and they fight to the end, and there's all these people dead on the stage. In a Chekhovian play, everybody is no one is really happy with the solution, and they're unhappy, but everyone's still alive at the end of the day. And I think that no one will be really happy with whatever solution, if there is a solution meted out, but it's better to be alive and a little bit dissatisfied than to be dead on the stage.
Well, I think the Palestinians in Gaza would certainly agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we seem to have emerged with a certain amount of agreement and a very healthy debate on both sides. Are there any last words, observations? Maybe I can pose a question about military support of Israel. There was much made of cutting off supply of military goods to Israel to continue the prosecution of its war against Hamas, and had incredible levels of devastation and death among the Palestinians. Canada has agreed to do this, but there was a bit of subterfuge involved because we've stopped supplying arms directly to Israel, but continue to do so through the United States. Should this be an issue that warrants some criticism of Canadian policy?
Reuven?
Well, how would that be expressed? That's my question. What means you have to express it? I think that people should protest arms shipments all the time. I'm for disarmament. Generally, I think arms are poison in the world. They're creating havoc, and our world is going to be less and less peaceful the more and more it is easy to produce and export arms. So I think that most countries have too many weapons, and it would be a blessing to reduce them wherever they are.
Peter?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, of course, I support with Reuven. I support both the direct and indirect sale of military equipment to Israel and to other countries at war. But I think it is largely this is a virtue signaling event. This is our contribution to Israel's military is insignificant in terms of the quantity. We're saying we don't like what you're doing, and I think that's a good thing to do.
Okay, that pretty well brings us to the end. I don't see any other. The question from Jean Hanna: how might Israel-Palestine look and be today if in November 1947, when the partition plan was approved by 35 out of 50 UN states, the Zionists had not started their campaign of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from their homes and lands, left all Palestinians in place, and just declared the state of Israel as it was? envy the Palestinians had been subjected to 30 years of British destruction of the Palestinian economy, land confiscation, imprisonment, and exile of Palestinian leaders. Any comments?
To me, it's unimaginable. I can't. It's too much of a counterfactual. I can't answer. But Peter, you probably have an idea.
The question is asking how would things have turned out? I think it would depend. The world alignment of forces at that time was in favor of the creation of a Jewish state. So whatever things happened specifically, that was the direction it was going. Remember the Soviet Union was in favor of it. Great Britain was in favor of it. The United States was in favor of it. So it was going to happen. And the Zionists had enough international support that they were actually going to be able to go far beyond the borders that were proposed by the UN. That was just a real expression of the relation of forces at that time. So I agree with Reuven. It's hard to, although I used a counterfactual in my argument earlier about the Mau, so I'm not opposed to counterfactuals, but in this case, I'm not sure what I can do to add value.
Okay, one last question and then a query. The question is from Deborah Parks, who asks the speakers to comment on Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication approach. Are you aware of it, and do you think more of it could be used to bring together Jews and Palestinians? And she gives a hyperlink in her question.
I'll answer it. I don't know Marshall Rosenberg's approach, but I believe very much in nonviolence. I've read a lot about Gandhi. I believe that Gandhi was able to win independence for India and have an amicable relationship with Britain after. I think he set a great example, and I would hope that future governments will permit nonviolence to flourish wherever they are, wherever nonviolent teachers exist.
Peter, I'm sure you agree with that sentiment.
I do, of course, and I can't add much more to it. It has to be based on a sentiment of equality. You can't have nonviolent discussion as long as one group is more powerful and wants to maintain their privileged position. That can't work. But if it's on the basis of genuine equality, of course.
I agree.
Okay, I think it's time to wind this up. We've gone a full hour. Richard Denton asks, was this recorded and available later? Yes, it was recorded, and we will release it in due course for public consumption. It'll be up on our YouTube video channel. So in closing, I would really like to give my hearty thanks to both Reuven and Peter for their lucid discussion and comments and their passion towards an issue which is almost intractable and getting more difficult almost by the day. But we rely on people like you to bring to us hopeful, optimistic recourse to the problems that seem to be intractable. And the Group of 78 would like to heartily thank you both, and maybe we can reconvene at some point in a more bright future.
Roy, thank you for your invitation, and Peter, thank you for being an interlocutor and a discussant. I learned very much. Thank you.
I think these are very difficult issues, and I think it's really important that they be tackled seriously and straightforward and with respect. And I feel that that's what happened here. So thank you very much, Roy, for organizing this, and Reuven and Gabriella, I think, is the one who suggested you speak, and that's great too. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella, too. Thank you.
Final word of thanks to Maud Stephanie, who's been anchoring this and has been tuning in from the back room. Thank you, Maud. And thank you to all our attendees for participating and for your questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Have a good day.